All right, good afternoon, everyone. It's good to see you all. As always, we appreciate you spending part of your weekend with us here at the National Military Park. Before we begin, a few bits of information. One, if you have a cell phone, we ask that you turn that off or put it on silent. Two, the winter lecture scheduled for tomorrow, Sunday, due to the winter weather, we are going to be rescheduling that to March 1st. Now, we don't make those decisions lightly. I know many of you have traveled a good distance to participate in the series, but out of an abundance of caution, let's say, we are going to reschedule that. So my apologies there. With that said, we're very lucky and fortunate to have with us today for this lecture, Mr. Philip Brown. Phil Brown was born and raised in Charlotte, North Carolina. He has worked in historic sites for the past 20 years. He began his career with the National Park Service in 2012 at Gettysburg National Military Park as a seasonal park ranger, later taking a permanent park guide position in 2015. From 2021 to 2024, he served in the Structures Preservation Branch of the Facilities Maintenance Division here at the battlefield. Throughout his career, he has served on incident management teams, providing relief after natural disasters and supported NPS special events across the nation. Since 2014, he has served as a wildland firefighter for the National Park Service, which has taken him to parks and forests in Maryland, Virginia, Montana, and California. And most recently, in September of 2024, he became the supervisory park ranger at Eisenhower National Historic Site, and it's in that capacity that we invited him to speak to you today. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Philip Brown.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, volume, good in the back? Okay. I'm going to begin with an apology. I am on what I hope is the very tail end of a head cold, so you'll have to forgive me if I sound a little congested or if I'm hitting my water a few times throughout the program. In my walk around before the beginning of our program, I did notice a number of familiar faces, which is great to see. As Chris mentioned, I did spend 9.5 years here in the interpretive division, where I met a lot of you on my programs on the battlefield and also here in this building. And I can't thank Chris and the interpretive staff here enough for allowing me the opportunity to come and talk to you about an event and a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. So how these typically work is the battlefield staff contacts the staff over at Eisenhower, or at least how it's worked over the past couple of years, and offered us a slot in this program, the Winter Lecture Series. And then they allow us to pick the topic. And we agreed to take one, and I agreed to give the talk. And then I began to think about what I could cover here in January of 2025. And my mind immediately drifted to the Battle of the Bulge, an event that we are experiencing the 80th anniversary of right now, really, as we are sitting here in this room together. So I started to think about that battle. And as it turns out, the Battle of the Bulge is the largest battle that the United States Army has ever been engaged in. It incorporated somewhere around 1 million people. It occurred over a front of about 80 miles in width, and it took place technically in 3 different countries. And I quickly realized that giving you a play-by-play of that battle for the next 50 minutes was not a good use of our time. So instead, I decided to kind of shift gears, and my mind then drifted to a trip that me and my wife took in 2019 on the 75th anniversary of the battle to the battlefields in Belgium, where we spent the better part of 2 weeks exploring the battlefields of those that were fought on 75 years ago. And what I was struck by on that trip was a couple of things. First of all, what remained, what you could still visually see on the landscape of those battlefields. Secondly, what you couldn't see anymore, what had not been preserved. And then additionally, what had been memorialized as well. And I guess I should start with a bit of a spoiler on this program. The Battle of the Bulge battlefield is not preserved in the same way that we see Gettysburg National Military Park. It's not one contiguous big piece of land. Again, reference my earlier comment on the scale of the battle. That would be impossible for life to continue in this region today and have what we have here at Gettysburg. Instead, what we see are these spot memorializations at a crossroads here, at a crossroads there, in a field here, a monument, a memorial, or a plaque describing what had happened there, in my case, 75 years earlier when I was there 5 years ago. And that's what I want to talk about today. Why are certain things preserved? Why are they not? How are some things commemorated the way they are? And how are others not at all? How this program is going to work is I'm going to, instead, again, not giving you a play-by-play of the battle, we're going to talk about 4 episodes in the Battle of the Bulge. After I tell you the story of the episode, at that point then I'm going to ask you a series of questions by way of a little interactive activity. It'll be by show of hands. Nobody's going to leave their seat. And it's not a quiz. It's strictly opinion-based questions that I'm going to be asking. But I think through those questions we're going to hopefully gain a little introspection in what's going on over there today and how we see things looking back. And then I guess I should add 2 more disclaimers. This program is not a criticism of what has been preserved and what has not. Instead, it's what historians call adding nuance, getting us to think about the how and why of things, less so a criticism of what has taken place. And then the final disclaimer I will give you, I am not a French or German speaker. In fact, my newly acquired Pennsylvania brethren would say I hardly speak English, being from the state of North Carolina. So forgive me on any mispronunciations. So to dive into our topic, I thought it would be a good idea to talk about the lens through which I approach this topic. And this story is going to take us back to my hometown of Charlotte, North Carolina, on the west side of the city, on a barely paved road called Pleasant Oak Circle. And it was there on that street at house number 6924 that I spent much of my childhood. But this story is not about that house at 6924. It's about the house next door, 6910, the home of this man, Robert Augustus Green, my grandfather. And if you're keeping track of names so far, you might be on to something. When my mom got married in the 1980s, she went from green to brown. She switched colors when she got married. But nonetheless, I was privileged to grow up next door to my grandfather. And if you have that experience, you know how special that is. My grandfather was a veteran of World War II, and he was a veteran of the Battle of the Bulge. So maybe, if we're talking about images, maybe this is a more appropriate image of him. This is him in 1942 at the time of his draft. And just 3 years later, this is him in 1945. So growing up next door to my grandfather, he's a very quiet guy. And I don't mean like in The Greatest Generation, you hear about this a lot. Like they didn't talk about the war. This guy was genuinely a man of very few words in almost every setting. I grew up one of 3 children. I had an older sister and I had a younger brother. And that can be kind of chaotic for the middle child, if you know anything about that. So maybe it was his quiet demeanor that really drew me to him. But by age of about 3 years old, his neighbors, which were all his peers, I grew up on a street of almost all World War II veterans, but all of those guys called me his shadow because I literally followed him around. His house sat on a 3-acre lot that he, for whatever reason, push mowed with an 18-inch wide push mower. And he would basically start on one end of the lot and through the week work his way across the lot and then just kind of start all over. But his neighbor said, and I started this before I had memory of it, his neighbor said that I would literally follow him up and down the mowing rows, just kind of watching what he was doing. By the age of 4, I was spending a lot of nights at his house. We had this ritual of going and getting haircuts together, and there was no way he was going to wait in line for a haircut. That was not an option. So he would be there before the barbershop opened, so when it was time to get a haircut, I'd spend the night at his house. And to sort of set the scene, we had this ritual we always followed. We always ate frozen pizza, cooked in a mid-20th century oven that always set off the smoke alarm, no matter what. And we would drink soda from reused yogurt cups. He was like definitely of the like Great Depression era, waste not, want not, mentality. And then we would transition to the living room. And to give you an idea of the living room, it was a dark wood-paneled room. The paneling had darkened over the years from the creosote coming out of his wood stove that he kept cranking October through March every year, even during the mild winters of North Carolina compared to what you all are used to. When we went into the living room, he would turn on a television. It was a wood-paneled console TV, sat right on the shag carpet floor there in the living room. And on it, we would watch every night Wheel of Fortune, and Jeopardy. They're aired back to back, at least they were in Charlotte on the syndicate there. Now this next part of the story I'm going to tell you, I actually don't have a memory of. It's fragmentary, but I do know it happened based off the later part of the story, which definitely did take place. It's one of my core memories of my childhood. At some point while we were watching TV, the topic of war came up. And this is going to form the first memory I have of human conflict, a topic that has held my attention my entire life. I don't know if it was a question on Jeopardy. I don't know if I had gotten bored with Jeopardy. I was 4 years old, and my eyes wandered around, and eventually it landed on the poster on his wall, which was his unit crest from the Second World War, and maybe I asked him, what is that? But at some point, he told me what war was. And I don't know how he navigated that topic. I have a 4-year-old son now. I don't know how to answer that question today when I was telling him what I was going to do to talk about today. But somehow he navigated that topic, a lived experience that he had, an experience in which he lost his brother during the Normandy campaign in July of 1944. Nonetheless, that conversation happened, and then we moved on to the next part of the ritual, which is where we sat down on his seafoam green vinyl couch, which really popped against that wood paneling. That's where I slept. He made my bed there, and he read from me a hardcover edition of a Raggedy Ann book, a collection of books that he acquired when the first grandchild came along in the 1970s. Now, at some point in the reading of that book, I interrupted him, and this is where the memory becomes very sharp. I interrupted him, and I said one question to him. I asked him, I said, "Did you win the war?" He had not gotten to that part earlier, evidently, because I was asking him the question. And he leaned down in that real quiet voice, and he said, "We whooped their butts." And in that moment, two things happened. First of all, my grandfather became the king of cool in my mind, right? I'm a 4-year-old. Somebody got their butt whooped. I got to know more. Where did this thing happen? Who did it involve? Why did they get their butt whooped? What is this thing, right? But also then, as I grew older, that really sat with me. It resonated with me that that's how he summed up to a 4-year-old the experience of World War II. Again, it might be a reduction of the experience, but nonetheless, that is the point that he wanted to put on me, right? That we whooped their butts. The other thing that happened, he becomes the king of cool, and then also at that point, the hook was set, right, for me in military history. I migrated to the books that he kept on his shelf there about the Second World War, primarily the pictures down the middle of those books as they were printed at the time. Then I migrated into the movies that he kept in his house, again, about the Second World War. And about this time is when the movie Gettysburg debuted, and that set the American Civil War bug in me, and that leads us to where we are right now, me standing in front of you talking about this topic. So that's the lens that I see all these events through. I wanted to begin by pointing that out. But again, we're going to talk about 4 episodes of the Battle of the Bulge, and I guess it would be something of an interpretive sin not to set a scene of some type for you. So I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes giving everyone on the same page a very brief overview of the Battle of the Bulge. So to get in the mindset, we have to take ourselves back to the late fall of 1944. The war has been raging across Europe now for years. The war has really begun to take a turn beginning on June 6, 1944, with the Allied reinvasion of Western Europe on D-Day. What that sets into effect is a series of domino events as the Allies push across much of France through Belgium and right up to the German border. And it's at this point that Nazi Germany really finds itself painted into a bit of a corner, because not only are things not going well on what we are calling the Western Front that we're talking about, but also the Eastern Front fighting the Soviets. Adolf Hitler, finding himself again kind of painted into a corner, begins to think about a counterattack, how to change the momentum of the war, and how to snatch some type of victory from the jaws of defeat. And this is where he devises the plan that eventually becomes the Battle of the Bulge. Much has been said about Hitler's megalomania. Raise your hand if you ever heard that term, megalomania, right? His obsession with all things large, massive, big into bravado. And that seems to have not been exaggerated in our assessment of him during the Battle of the Bulge. He commits somewhere around 600,000 German soldiers to this fight, supported over by 1,000 tanks. The idea is that they will punch through a heavily wooded part of Belgium through the American lines, which on our map from the era is the original lines are the black dotted line running on the right side of the page there. Using a piece of terrain called the Ardennes Forest, a heavily forested area in Belgium. He's going to use foul weather as well. He's timing the attack on foul weather to preclude the Allies from using air cover in the defense against this attack. The idea is that they're going to punch a hole in the Allied lines and then drive on the port of Antwerp, which is now the major supply base for the Allied forces bringing men and material onto the European continent. That hammer blow attack falls on the morning of December 16th, 1944, and what unfolds is 5 or 6 weeks of some of the heaviest combat of the Second World War unfolding in some of the harshest weather conditions that the European continent had to offer to either side. The Allied lines, though, they fall back. They do not just break and crumble and run. Instead, they begin this retreat, forming a big bend in the line. That's the heavy black line you see going across the page there. And that bend, bow, or bulge in the line is what gives the battle its name, the Battle of the Bulge. Dwight Eisenhower and the rest of the Allied High Command respond with a two-pronged counterattack, one coming up from the south on the bottom of our page on the map, and another coming down from the north to pinch off and seal off that bulge and then push the Germans back to their original line of attack. That battle concludes sometime around January 20th, 1945, give or take 5 days, depending on the sources you look at. I used to sweat it out when I had to summarize the Battle of Gettysburg in 20 minutes. I just did the largest battle the Army's ever been in a space of about 5. But that's really all you need to know of a summary of the Battle of the Bulge to understand the 4 stories that we're going to talk about today. These stories are also going to run chronological, I should add. So our first story is about this man on the screen here. This is Lieutenant Lyle Balk, Jr., who managed to get into the Missouri National Guard in the 1930s at the age of 14. Before the war, he was offered a position in officer candidate school, graduated 10th in his class of that, and by 1944, he is a platoon commander in the 394th Infantry Regiment of the 99th Division, and that's my grandfather's division, and kind of got me interested in this topic. The platoon that he's in charge of is called the Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon. They basically had the same type of role that cavalry did during the American Civil War. They acted as sort of the eyes and the ears of the unit that they serve. They are not considered like a mainline fighting unit. They typically were not lightly armed, or they were not heavily armed. They were typically lightly armed with a focus on maneuverability, covering a lot of ground, and maintaining communication with the regimental headquarters that they were reporting back to. Balk had under his command in that platoon 18 men, and in December of 1944, specifically December 10th, he was sent to the town of Lanzarote, Belgium, with the goal of basically taking a position where he could keep an eye on Lanzarote. Now, why would they be concerned about Lanzarote? It's a town of only about 25 buildings, but it served as a major crossroads. Sound familiar to anybody? And so the idea was keep an eye on the crossroads, monitor it for German movement, report back to the regimental headquarters on what you see. But they really never gave him any orders to put up a fight. It was literally just go and watch and observe. Well, Balk wanted to give his men every fighting chance they could should they come under attack. So prior to setting off for Lanzarote, he took some souvenirs that he'd acquired on some patrols, some German military souvenirs, and he traded them for an armored Jeep with a .50 caliber machine gun mounted to it, something he was not authorized to have, but nonetheless, that's what he was going to take to Lanzarote. He also picked up 4 artillery forward observers so that he could have artillery fire brought down in front of his position should that be needed. And this is all, of course, what we call foreshadowing that you're hearing now. He took his men to Lanzarote, and when he got there, he fell into a series of foxholes. So foxholes is a term you're probably going to hear several times throughout the program. They're not, really heavily built trenches. They're small fighting positions. A lot of cases they were shaped like L's, and they would be occupied by 2 or 3 men. They'd be 4 or 5 feet deep with a dirt parapet across the top to give you some protection. So he found the foxholes he was assigned to. Those were already dug by a prior unit to his arrival at Lanzarote, but he changed them. He looked at them and said, okay. He ordered his men to go out and cut down logs of about 12 inches in diameter, and they piled them on top of the foxholes, and then piled dirt on top of those, and then it snowed on top of that, and they become invisible. He basically built small fortified bunkers across a front of about 300 yards in width. So these men are spread really thin, 22 people over a 300-yard front. And all of this would prove to be useful because on the night of December 15th, the night before the outbreak of the Battle of the Bulge, he could hear in the distance the rumble of German armor, German tanks in the distance, the clinking of the tracks and the wheels. And he told his men to stay up the entire night. They had been rotating out in shifts, getting some rest. That order was out the window. We're staying up all night. And on the morning of December 16th, just as the sun began to come up, they could see in the distance the approach of German soldiers. These are actually paratroopers. They're coming into Lanzarote. He had picked out ahead of time a spot in a field in front of his men, and he told himself if the Germans got to that point, that's when he would tell them to open fire. That was his trigger point for ambushing any German soldiers moving through Lanzarote. Just so happened that as the Germans were hitting that point, and Bulge was literally hitting the radio key to order all the foxholes to open fire, that a young girl ran out of a building in Lanzarote and ran right to the Germans that he was looking at. The young girl pointed at the ridge. They couldn't hear what was going on, but she's pointing. And in that moment, all the Germans hit the ground. Now Bulge is thinking to himself, what do we do? Do we open fire and potentially take this girl's life? Do I lose the element of surprise? He ended up choosing to let the girl go free. She scurried off. The moment she was out of line of fire, he gave the order, and his men unleashed a hail of bullets into the Germans. What would follow is about a 10-hour-long struggle for these 22 men against about 500 German attackers. They committed these wave-like attacks, and Bulge was seen running from foxhole to foxhole to foxhole, helping his men transfer ammunition, whoever needed it, encouraging them to keep up their fire, and calling in artillery on their position as well to fend off the German attackers. As the sun's beginning to go down, though, their ammunition is beginning to run low. The Germans make an end-run attack on them on the flank, and unfortunately, the entire INR platoon falls captive. Just as the Germans are pulling Bulge out of his hole, a couple things happen. First of all, he's shot through the calf by somebody, and then a German puts a gun in his back, pulls the trigger, and at that point, Bulge probably heard the loudest click of his entire life. Because the firing pin fell on an empty chamber. The gun had run dry right before the German got to his hole. In the fighting, only one of his platoon members was killed in action. 8 of them are wounded. They're initially taken to a tavern right there in Lanzarote, and it became apparent that the Germans weren't moving out of the town. Evidently, the German officers on the scene thought that the woods were completely full of Americans, and it wasn't just one platoon, so they decided to wait until daybreak before they moved out. This was a problem for one German officer who arrived on the scene sometime in the late evening hours. This is Colonel Joachim Piper, who we'll hear about more later on. Piper stormed into the tavern and began to question the German officers as to why they were laying around, what are we doing, why aren't we moving forward? And they started to explain to him that they believed that the woods were full of American soldiers and they just captured a small platoon so far. This would be instrumental in the unfolding of events because Joachim Piper is commanding the lead of one of the main 3 German thrusts, and they get delayed by about 18 hours due to the actions of the INR platoon, as it's called, of the 394th Infantry Regiment. Bulge and his men would all spend the rest of the war in POW camps. It just so happens that all of the wounded ones that made it to POW camps survived. They would go on to become the most heavily decorated platoon in the United States military in either theater of the Second World War, both European and Pacific. In the end, they would account for 4 Distinguished Service Crosses, 5 Silver Stars, and 9 Bronze Stars in an 18-man platoon. Shortly after the conclusion of this fighting, another little wrinkle in this story is when they're captured in when they're in the tavern and Piper moves out. That's when the clock struck midnight. And at that point, Bulge realized it was his 21st birthday. So all of it's happened before he turned 21 years old. So now we're going to do the interactive portion. I'm going to ask you 3 questions. No trick questions, not a quiz. Who here believes that the fighting location of the INR platoon that I've just told you about should be preserved? Just raise your hand. Okay. Let's imagine there's a hypothetical organization that's tasked with preserving and maintaining the ground that they fought on. Who here would donate a sum of money, any sum, on a monthly basis for that cause? Hypotheticals, I know. Okay. Let's imagine you live in a locality where the preservation or development of this site that I've just described became a political issue. Who here is willing to become vocal in that political process, be it letter writing, town hall meetings, or even voting? Show of hands. Okay. So now I'm going to tell you what's there today. So again, in 2019, I traveled with my wife to Belgium, and Lanzarote was definitely on the list. I had heard about their story by way of a book written by Alex Kershaw called The Longest Winter. And I guess this is a good time to pause. Who here have heard that story before I just told it? A few of you have heard the story of the Battle of Lanzarote Ridge. Yeah, okay. So I think the sparse number of hands raised is telling, and you're going to find out a little bit more about that in a minute. So we go to Lanzarote, and I had some maps with me, I had the book, and it was pretty easy to find the site of the tavern that they were taken to after they were captured. And then based off of the compass, you can pretty easily figure out what field they were firing across, which will then tell you what ridge that they were on and what wood line their foxholes were in. And we're walking along the sidewalks and then eventually driving the roads in the SUV we rented, and realized that the fields were all pasture land. There were livestock in the pastures. It was all barbed wire fences. We weren't really interested in upsetting the locals as American tourists, so we didn't go cross-country across those pastures. Instead, we looked at the woods beyond the pasture where those foxholes had been in 1944, and we looked at the roads and realized it was a highway that went right by the woods, and then off of that was actually all public land leading right up to the beginning of that pasture, and there were like Forest Service type roads going through it. We had come all this way, right? You have to go and see what you can see. So we hopped in the car and we drove through on the highway. We got off on the Forest Service roads, and we kind of drove along until the roads got kind of rough, and we decided, let's just do this on foot. So out came the phones, and out came Google Earth, and we watched our little blue dot moving along through the woods as we're walking. And after about 45 minutes of walking, this is what we found. It's really obvious where they were. Again, with the improvement of the foxholes and the amount of fortifications they put up, the evidence is still there. But there's no wayside markers like we see here at Gettysburg. There's no signs. There is a memorial. I can't go without saying that. There is a memorial to the I&R platoon in Lanzarote. It's a small rock with a plaque attached to it, and the whole thing would fit on top of this podium here in front of me. And it actually doesn't declare that it's the most decorated platoon in the Second World War. But it's not a really well set apart area, and it's not easy to get to. We weren't following a social trail to the foxholes. We weren't even following a deer path. We were just walking through the woods, watching our blue dot on the screen move. Till I thought we've got to be close. Let's walk along the edge of the woods, and eventually we stumbled into their position. But I think the fact that it's not preserved in the traditional sense that we would all maybe expect to see is a testament to a couple of different things. First of all, it is a testament to their experience. You see, because they all became prisoners of war, there was no report filed by anybody in the platoon on what happened. There was no media coverage for what happened because nobody told their story. Their story was silent because their voices were cut off behind German lines. And then additionally, by the time they are released from captivity in 1945, the world has moved on. A lot of things have happened up to this point. Interest in the story really wasn't there, and administratively, the Army had really moved on at that point, and they weren't accepting, really new reports or putting out a lot of attention on it. Their story goes really publicly completely unheard until the publication of a book called The Bitter Woods, written by John Eisenhower, Dwight Eisenhower's son. He interviewed Lyle Balk and published his story. And after the publication of the story, Lyle Balk thought, well, maybe I should seek out something for my men in the platoon. You see, what the Bitter Woods did was it set a context for what the INR platoon did. It informed Bulge of the delay and of the ramifications of what his men did. So he wrote to the Army and explained his case and said, I want to get recognition from my platoon. The response was he got a silver star put in the mail to him. He got it in his mailbox. What would follow then was a pretty serious letter writing campaign by other members of the platoon with the United States government. And what they found was that in this point in history, we're now into the late 1970s, there was a bit of a statute of limitations on giving out awards, and they were beyond it. Too much time had passed since the events for the Army to review their case. And that was, in fact, true right up until a public law was signed on December 14th, 1979, that exempted this unit from that rule and this unit only. And that law was signed by the late, great Jimmy Carter. So at that point, that's when the awards are doled out. 1981 is when this unit got its recognition. So in some cases, the places we see it today is affected by the events themselves and the technicalities that follow. That's part of the lens of this story. And I can't help when I make a Gettysburg comparison that this is kind of their Culp's Hill, right? It's the less traveled part of the battlefield. It's the story that gets really not heard at the time during the war and something that you have to really dig for today. Not because it's not preserved or not memorialized. It is out there, but in our minds, it doesn't ring the same way that another place on the Gettysburg battlefield does. So our next episode is about this gentleman here buried actually in the Gettysburg National Cemetery, a man named Frederick Clark, who was a member of Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. If you know anything about the Battle of the Bulge and that unit, you know exactly where this story is headed. The 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion had a really interesting job. They actually used instrumentation from the 1940s to determine the location of German artillery fire based off of the sound it made. Right? So they were locating where those German batteries are based off, again, the guns, and also they had instruments for detecting muzzle flash. What I'm getting at is they're not a frontline fighting unit. They're not heavily armed. In the melee of December 16th, they are largely cut off, Battery B is, from the rest of their unit, and they're traveling on their own when they fell into the crosshairs of Joachim Peiper, the colonel from the tavern with the INR platoon. The 1st SS Panzer that he's in charge of, they open fire on the 285th, they ambush them, and it's not a very long fight. It's more of a skirmish with a lot of men attempting to surrender shortly after the beginning of the gunfire. What we know of Frederick Clark is that, from all accounts, he was actually attempting to surrender at the beginning of the fight when he was shot down by SS soldiers. What would follow would be another 130 of his comrades surrendering. Those 130 prisoners of war were first taken to a courtyard where there's a bit of deliberation on what should be done, and then eventually the decision is made to take them into a field next to that courtyard where they were systematically machine gunned by SS soldiers. In the end, 84 of them would be killed there in that field. It's not the only case where prisoners of war are actually killed by Joachim Peiper's men. And in fact, he would stand trial for it. He would initially be sentenced to death for war crimes. That would be commuted to a life sentence, but then he's eventually released. But justice eventually caught up with him because he was murdered in 1976 by French communists in his home. It's also not the only case of prisoners of war being killed in that definitely happened on the Allied side. There were retributions for what happened in what is known as the Malmedy Massacre, the event we're talking about now. But nonetheless, this story is one that is kind of a touchstone. It's the largest of its kind, the largest tragedy of that kind that happened during the Second World War, the killing of prisoners of war. So now we'll go ahead and jump to the questions. Who here thinks that site should be preserved, where this awful tragedy occurred? Okay. Who here would donate a sum of money to an organization for its preservation on a monthly basis? Okay. Who here would get vocal if it became a political issue, that this is going to disappear forever, that we wouldn't have the Malmedy Massacre site to go back to and remind people of what happened here? Yeah, I feel like this is a pretty easy one to swing through, right? If you go there today, there is a very touching monument. This is how it looked in 2019. It's a kind of a semicircular wall. The screen kind of takes the curve out. There is kind of a chapel-like structure, and then I'll just point out there within the wall are these little plaques, and on it you'll find 84 names of those that were killed. More to the point for us is the large plaque on the right side of the image. This says on it, "To the memory of the soldiers of the United States Army who, while prisoners of war, were massacred by Nazi troops on this spot on 17th December 1944. And it's repeated in French to make sure everyone that comes there that's local understands what happened. But then some of you are already pointing at the screen. What's below it? All right, the subtext is, "We here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain." Abraham Lincoln. And that is, of course, from the Gettysburg Address. So the lens of tragedy that those that put up this memorial look through take them to a place where their goal is to make sure that nobody forgets these men and what died here. We're not going to talk a lot about the Germans. We're not even going to really talk a lot about the event, but you will remember their names. When you go to this site, that's what you're going to definitely walk away from. There's no avoiding it. The third episode I want to talk about is not of a group of people per se, but it is of a place. And that is the town of Bastogne. Right off the bat, who's heard of Bastogne? Yeah, here we go. That's the very thing we're going to talk about. So this is a map from 1944 of the town. The town is in the middle. For those that the text might get a little blurry for you. And you'll notice the dark lines there, a road network coming and going from downtown Bastogne. Again, sound familiar? Hitting you over the head with the Gettysburg reference there. The town of Bastogne was initially well behind Allied lines at the beginning of the battle, but that hammer blow-like attack that sends the Allies reeling puts whether or not Bastogne is going to be controlled by the Allies or the Germans into serious question. And the Allied High Command, recognizing that holding these road networks against a German, largely mechanized attack is important, and so they begin to rush troops into the Bastogne area to be sure that it is held by the Allies. Those troops are primarily a part of the 101st Airborne Division, a very famous unit now looking back 80 years ago. They storm into the town just as it is sealed off, as the Germans surround the entirety of it. And what results is a siege of the town, with the 101st Airborne and a number of other units cut off from the rest of the Allies, with no communication really to the outside world to any degree. It becomes a story of, like American grit and fortitude and heroism, and a lot of that has to do with this gentleman on the screen here. This is General Anthony McAuliffe. He was the assistant division commander of the 101st Airborne. He's not the actual division commander. The actual division commander was here in the United States during the Battle of the Bulge, attending a conference when this guy gets the job of being the commander on the scene in Bastogne. And the story really comes to a point on the morning of December 20th, just as the siege is locked in. The Germans actually sent a note to the American commander asking for their surrender. It was a multi-paragraph message about, avoiding future bloodshed, and if there are civilian casualties, they're going to be your fault, which is just incredibly ironic, given the author, right, of the message. But they were demanding the American surrender. Evidently, and there's several different versions of the story, McAuliffe evidently was handed this note in a half-awake stupor. He was pulled out of his bunk and said, here's this note, the Germans want us to surrender. He apparently came out of his bedroom into his headquarters and said, "What's this about the Germans wanting to surrender to us?" And they were like, no, that's not what's going on. They're asking for us to surrender. And he responded with two words, and I'll give them to you as sterilely as I can. He said, "Ah, nuts." Now, I just read an audiobook where the author, or I should say the reader of the audiobook, interpreted that to be like an "ah, shucks." So it's like, "ah, nuts," which is just an incredible thing to say when someone's asking you to surrender, but that's nonetheless what came out of his mouth. And somebody in his headquarters said, well, let's just have that be the message. And it became the message. The response to this multi-paragraph asked for them to surrender comes back with a simple message. It said, to the German commander, nuts. Signed, American commander. Right? And this is immediately picked up by the propaganda machine of the Allies. Right? It's gold. Right? It's the resolve. Again, it's that grit. It's the heroism of the 101st Airborne holding out, completely surrounded in a siege in Bastogne. And that really then takes off to be really the story of the entire Bulge for a lot of people. I did a show of hands a second ago who had heard of the town of Bastogne, and the amount of attention that is brought upon them really is generated in large part through this. So, show of hands. Who's going to preserve Bastogne? Yeah. Okay, who would donate money to an organization responsible for preserving Bastogne? Okay, who would become vocal in a political, big popular area. And if you go there today, it is very similar to visiting the town of Gettysburg. You have definitely arrived in a World War II town when you travel to Bastogne. They have a phenomenal museum, the Bastogne War Museum, which is very comparable to the museum that is behind many of you on the other side of those walls here in the Gettysburg Visitor Center. It's a really powerful place to go because you're just saturated by that concept of this place is here for the history of what happened here in 1944 and 45. A lot of that was perpetuated by the nuts message and the propaganda campaign that went along with it. And then it's continued in popular culture through a movie some of you may have heard of, The Battle of the Bulge, debuted in 1965, starring Henry Fonda and Robert Shaw, a movie that, according to Dwight Eisenhower, was so historically inaccurate he could not sit through it. He walked out of the theater. He didn't finish it. And the story of this movie, they touch on a few other episodes. Malmedy is included in it. There's a very tragic scene. That was very, shocking for me to see, probably as a 5-year-old, the Malmedy Massacre occurring in 1965 full color. But then the rest of the movie really focuses on a kind of a weird telling of the story of Bastogne. And our focus on Bastogne moves forward even to today in that, believe it or not, last December, or just a month ago, when the 80th anniversary was really, kind of moving along there in Bastogne, there were hats people were wearing that said Bastogne 80th instead of Battle of the Bulge 80th. And I'm struck by the parallel again to Gettysburg. Ask any American on the street, name a town associated with the Civil War. What are you going to get? Yeah, and there's a lot of interpreters who take pride in that, right? Like kind of the Civil War mecca of sorts, for better or worse. But nonetheless, Bastogne has a stranglehold on attention. Just something to think about. Just something to think about how that came to be. What's the lens in which history moves through that you're looking through today? Now, the final episode I'm going to talk to you about is I'm going to be cryptic. I'll say right off the bat. It's going to sound hypothetical, but it's a real story. And it's a story of an ordinary group of American soldiers that were involved in the defense of the town of Bastogne. They were specifically sent into a heavily wooded area on the outskirts of the town, about 4 kilometers from downtown Bastogne, and they were tasked with holding that piece of ground at all costs. They experienced some of the harshest weather conditions, again, that the European continent had to offer, and they did so after riding in on a truck, they are part of the 101st Airborne, with very little winter clothing. Now, it just so happened that the wooded area that they occupied is going to be relentlessly shelled by German artillery, and the type of artillery shell they were using was intentionally designed to explode in the treetops of the heavily wooded area. And these trees, they're 75 to 80 foot tall pine trees, 12-inch diameter logs. So not only do you have shrapnel raining down on these men, but you also have entire tops of trees coming down on them, making it genuinely a hellscape. This set of woods would be where the last Christmas was spent for 14 of the 150 or so men that I'm talking about in this story as they would leave behind those men in the woods. Additionally, another 80 of them would be wounded there, either by the Germans or by Mother Nature. About half of them were evacuated with cold weather injuries out of this wooded area. It was truly an experience that welded them together into an almost family-like organization that they would never be able to forget, both those that they served with and the place in which they served. But it's just an ordinary unit. And this story can be repeated over and over and over again up and down this 80-mile wide front. And again, I know I've been hypothetical, but here's the question. Imagine it's 100 acres of woods. You know what happened there. Do you think it should be preserved because of what took place there in 1944? Show of hands. Who would donate money to an organization that was tasked with preserving it? Who would get politically active if somebody was going to develop it? And yes, the thing that I've been withholding is their exact identity. And of course, I've been talking about troops commanded by this captain in the photo, who's a major at the time. This is Dick Winters. And I've been talking about Easy Company of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne, made really famous by two things: the Band of Brothers book by Stephen Ambrose, and of course the mini-series, which I've combined in one image. See what I did there with the cover? Published by HBO, which really, in large part, that mini-series has sort of spawned another wave in World War II interest that we're still sort of riding today. There's a lot of young people that are really into World War II history because of this 10-part mini-series. And indeed, if you travel there today, you're going to have quite an experience. This is their monument. That's a monument to one company, by the way. Again, I cannot take anything away from what these men did, but let's just go through the exercise of what you see there today compared to some of these other stories. This set of woods is called the Jacques Woods. That was the name it had at the time. It overlooked the town of Foix. That's the one pronunciation I'm going to get right here. And these are their foxholes as you see it today. It might look a little bit different if you can remember how they looked at Lanzarote. When my wife and I arrived at the Jacques Woods, we encountered a very different scene from the rest of our trip. When we were in Lanzarote, there were 3 other people there touring, and we were there the morning of, to the hour, 75 years to the date, of which the Battle of Lanzarote Ridge was happening. It was a family of 3 stationed in Germany with a private tour guide. When we were in the town of Cronkite, that's where my grandfather served, we were literally the only people in his fighting position, again, the day of, the hour of, 75 years to the date, which was really cool. Had it to ourselves, but it was noticeable. When we went into the town of Spa, that's where we stayed, and talked to any of the locals, specifically our Airbnb hosts, they were surprised to hear why we were there. You're doing what? Oh, the World War II battlefield. Oh, okay. When we got to the Jacques Woods, there were cars lining the shoulders of the roads. There were tour buses idling on the shoulders of the roads. There were people climbing in and out of these foxholes constantly. That's what gives them their appearance. And we immediately looked at one another, my wife being a former park ranger here, and said, "We've arrived at Little Round Top." That's what it was. This was, like the Holy Land of World War II tourism. I think it's a great story to focus on. You can't take any of the attention away from it. It deserves all it gets. But it's interesting that the other stuff doesn't quite get the same attention. Now, that was the story in 2019. You go there today, and this is what you're met with. You get a $20 ticket to get into the Jacques Woods. Now, that ticket goes through the Bastogne War Museum, a benevolent organization, but this is the control measure that they have had to implement. Am I hitting you over the head with the Little Round Top reference yet? Right? The park just went through a 2-year closure of Little Round Top to do a rehabilitation project because it was loved to death in much the same way that the Jacques Woods have been loved to death over these past few years. Again, these are just things to consider. Again, my goal was not to criticize the preservation efforts that have taken place or the strategies that have been adopted most recently, but to add nuance. And I encourage you, anytime you're traveling to a historic place, think about what you're looking at. Think even before you go, why am I going? What lens am I looking through that has pushed me to go and see these places? It might tell you a little bit about yourself, and it might tell you a little bit about the past. For me, the lens will always be my grandfather and 6910 Pleasant Oak Circle. Thank you for coming. I'll be around here for questions if you don't have any. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.